All of the material I have obtained from AI. I am going to omit my query questions in many instances. First, I asked. I omitted my query. It was wordy. In short, I asked for instances in Romans, KJV, where concepts of the law are mentioned. Yes, you are correct. Among the New Testament books, Romans is one of the most sustained discussions of the law, Greek, nomos, especially in relation to sin, faith, righteousness, grace, Israel, and the believer's life. However, there are well over 70 references to law in Romans, so it is impossible to quote all of them within 500 words. Instead, below are the principal passages that summarize Paul's doctrine of the law. Romans 2:12. For as many as have sinned without law shall also perish without law, and as many as have sinned in the law shall be judged by the law. Paul teaches that the law is a standard of judgment. Possessing it does not exempt one from accountability. Romans 2:13. For not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified. Merely knowing the law is insufficient, obedience is required. Romans 3:20. Therefore by the deeds of the law there shall no flesh be justified in his sight, for by the law is the knowledge of sin. The law reveals sin but cannot justify sinners before God. Romans 3:28. Therefore we conclude that a man is justified by faith without the deeds of the law. Justification comes through faith rather than law-keeping. Romans 3:31. Do we then make void the law through faith? God forbid, yet we establish the law. Faith does not abolish the law's validity, it places it in its proper role. Romans 4:15. Because the law worketh wrath, for where no law is, there is no transgression. Law defines transgression and thus exposes people to judgment. Romans 5:20. Moreover the law entered, that the offense might abound. The law makes sin more apparent and manifest. Romans 6:14. For yet are not under the law, but under grace. Believers are no longer under the law as a covenantal authority governing justification. Romans 7:7. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? God forbid. Paul insists the law itself is good, it reveals sin. Romans 7:12. Wherefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy, and just, and good. The problem is not the law but human sinfulness. Romans 7:14. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. The law reflects God's character, while fallen humanity struggles to obey it. Romans 7:22-23. For I delight in the law of God after the inward man. Paul describes an internal conflict between God's law and the law of sin. Romans 8:2. For the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus hath made me free from the law of sin and death. A new governing principle operates through Christ and the Spirit. Romans 8:3. For what the law could not do, in that it was weak through the flesh. The law could identify sin but could not overcome human corruption. Romans 8:4. That the righteousness of the law might be fulfilled in us. The Spirit enables what the law pointed toward. Romans 10:4. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to every one that believeth. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to every one that believeth. Christ is the culmination, goal, or completion of the law's role in obtaining righteousness. Romans 13:8-10. Love is the fulfilling of the law. Love summarizes and fulfills the moral intent of the commandments. In broad outline, Paul's argument in Romans is: 1. The law is holy, just, and good. Rom. 7. 2. The law reveals sin and condemns sinners. Rom. 3, 5, 7. 3. The law cannot justify or save. Rom. 3. 4. Justification comes through faith in Christ. Rom. 3, 4. 5. Believers are no longer under the law as a means of righteousness. Rom. 6. 6. Through the Spirit, the true intent of God's law is fulfilled in believers. Rom. 8:13. Those 6 points capture the backbone of Paul's doctrine of law in Romans. I asked, in more technical terms, what is justification in the book of Romans? Here is the answer. In Romans, justification is God's act of declaring a person righteous in His sight. It is a lawful or judicial term, not primarily a moral transformation. Paul argues that no one is justified by keeping the law perfectly. Rather, justification is granted through faith in Christ. Romans 3:28, 5:1. The person is counted righteous because of God's grace, not because he has earned righteousness by works. In short, justification is acquittal and right standing before God. How many chapters are in Romans? The book of Romans contains 16 chapters. It is traditionally divided roughly as follows. Romans 1:4 Human sinfulness and justification by faith. Romans 5:8 The effects of justification, grace, sin, the law, and life in the Spirit. Romans 9:11 Israel, election, and God's purposes concerning Jews and Gentiles. Romans 12:16 Practical instruction on conduct, community, authority, conscience, and personal greetings. Of all Paul's epistles, Romans is generally regarded as his most systematic treatment of righteousness, faith, sin, grace, and the law. I asked, of all of the quotes in Romans above, regarding concepts of the law, are there significant cross-references elsewhere in the Bible of these quotes? Here is the answer. Yes. In fact, one reason Romans has been so influential is that Paul is not presenting these ideas in isolation. Much of Romans is a sustained interpretation of the Torah, the prophets, and the Psalms. Below are some of the most significant cross-references. Romans 2:13. The doers of the law shall be justified. Cross-references. Leviticus 18:5 Which if a man do, he shall live in them. Deuteronomy 27:26 Curse upon those who do not continue in the law. Ezekiel 20:11 Life associated with doing God's statutes. Paul is echoing the biblical principle that obedience, not mere hearing, is required. Romans 3:20. By the law is the knowledge of sin. Cross-references. Genesis 3:7 Awareness of transgression. Psalm 19:7-11 The law reveals and instructs. 1 Corinthians 15:56 The strength of sin is the law. The law functions as revelation, exposing what sin is. Romans 3:28. Justified by faith without the deeds of the law. The law functions as revelation, exposing what sin is. Romans 3:28. Justified by faith without the deeds of the law. Cross-references. Genesis 15:6 Abraham believed God. Habakkuk 2:4 The just shall live by his faith. Galatians 2:16 Nearly identical argument. Genesis 15:6 is especially foundational to Paul's argument. Romans 3:31. We established the law. Cross-references. Matthew 5:17 Christ did not come to destroy but to fulfill. Jeremiah 31:33 Law written in the heart. Paul argues that faith confirms rather than abolishes God's instruction. Romans 4:15. Where no law is, there is no transgression. Cross-references. Romans 5:13. James 4:17 Sin involves violation of known duty. Transgression is often understood as crossing a known boundary. Romans 5:20. The law entered, that the offense might abound. Cross-references. Exodus 20, giving of the law. Galatians 3:19 The law was added because of transgressions. The law increases awareness and accountability. Romans 6:14. Not under the law, but under grace. Cross-references. Jeremiah 31:31-34. Ezekiel 36:26-27. Paul's language reflects prophetic promises of inward transformation. Romans 7:12. The law is holy, and the commandment holy. Cross-references. Psalm 19:7. Psalm 119, throughout. Paul's view of the law is fundamentally positive. Romans 7:22-23. I delight in the law of God. Cross-references. Psalm 1:2. Psalm 119:16, 47, 70, 77, 174. The language of delight in God's law is deeply rooted in the Psalms. Romans 8:2-4. The law of the Spirit of life. Cross-references. Ezekiel 36:27. Jeremiah 31:33. These are perhaps the strongest Old Testament parallels. Both prophets speak of God's Spirit enabling obedience. Romans 10:4. Christ is the end of the law. Cross-references. Matthew 5:17. Luke 24:44. Isaiah 53. Paul sees the law pointing toward and culminating in the Messiah. Romans 13:8-10. Love is the fulfilling of the law. Cross-references. Leviticus 19:18 Love thy neighbor as thyself. Matthew 22:37-40 All the law hangs on love of God and neighbor. Galatians 5:14. This is one of the clearest links between Romans and Christ's own summary of the law. If one were to identify the three Old Testament passages that stand behind Romans more than any others, they would likely be Genesis 15:6 Abraham's faith counted for righteousness. Jeremiah 31:31-34 The law written on the heart. Habakkuk 2:4 The just shall live by faith. And if one were to identify the three Psalms most reflected in Romans' discussion of the law, they would likely be Psalm 19 The perfection and revelatory function of God's law. Psalm 32 Forgiveness and imputed righteousness, quoted directly in Romans 4. Psalm 119 Delight in God's law, reflected strongly in Romans 7. Alright, alright, alright. I was intending to create a summary video of Romans, but the quotes related to the law have become so extensive and lengthy.